I would like to introduce my second panel today, which is blockchains, building better base realities block by block. What a tongue twister. And maybe to say like a couple of words about like my reasons for doing this panel is that like 2 years ago I started like an interview series with people who create like projects that are alternatives to the current system. And they are like more kind of hardware-based, they're co-ops, seasteading, and other startup society projects. And kind of the idea was that our socio-economic system is kind of like this fabric made of like politics, economics, society that expands to all of our lives and that decides how we spend our resources and how we behave towards the future. So it seems like getting this fabric right makes it much more likely that we get everything else right. So society is really like this map that we lay on the territory that we live in to help us navigate in it. And that is fine, but we kind of tend to forget that it's a map and not the territory itself. And our maps have kind of really stopped working on a fundamental basis, right? So we're not really taking into account any new facts that we learn about incentives, about social needs, about corruption, about diversity, privacy, flexibility. And even though we know that driving with this faulty map can lead to crashes. And I think that the main problem here is really not that, we don't know like the problems, we don't know how to do better, we don't have any solutions to the problems, but I think the problem is that we're kind of stuck in this gridlock, right? We're stuck in the current system, we're really entangled in it, and it's hard to really disentangle. And change within the system is slow, and this is why, blockchain seems so exciting to me, because initially, it is this kind of virtual experimental ground, right, that can coexist with the current paradigm that is still existent, and while we're building this new paradigm as we speak. And so it's this new kind of experimental system really where we can take the knowledge about what worked well and what didn't work well in the current system, and we can really build better from scratch. It's kind of this new operating system for the whole of society. We have from currency, of course, which is big right now, to companies that can become DAOs, to the underlying legal structure of the economy, to allowing people to trade in mutually beneficial ways via smart contracts, right? To transparent voting in politics even. And the best thing is we don't have to do that. We don't have to start a new state to do that. But we can breed this new prototype inside the current system and wait, and it grows with the current system, it competes with it until it maybe eventually might do a genetic takeover. Or this is at least how it should be in theory, right? Like this is at least like what could happen. But this kind of utopian flash has worn off a little now. I mean, like crypto is certainly going quite strong and volatile, but I would like to know where the world-rocking blockchain concepts are. There's a lot of ICOs happening, right? They're popping up left and right, but it's really hard to see the forest for the trees. And I don't know. On this panel, I would really like to find out where this grand vision of kind of blockchain-based world visions is. Whether I'm just being idealistic and wanting one, whether I'm being impatient and I just have to wait a little longer, or whether I'm being ignorant and like the good concepts are already there, I just don't know about them. So I'm beyond excited really to have Nathana, Sharma, Zooko, Wilcox, Mark Miller, and Nick Kritikos here. Thank you so much for joining today. I really appreciate it. Thanks a lot. Okay, and as I said also with the previous panel, if you would like to have access to the readings that we will be discussing, they are all indexed on existentialhope.com. And from there, many of the readings will be in society and economics, and some others will be in AI and cyberspace. All right, so maybe let's start with introductions, right? Please introduce yourselves in like a sentence or two in like how your past and your work relates to the topic at hand.
Nick Kritikos, Global Business Development for Consensys. Prior to coming to Consensys, I worked for Microsoft for a few years, Oracle for more years than I can count, and even Borland prior to that. I've always been a part of the emerging technology scene, and working in blockchain at Consensys is kind of a realization of that.
Cool. Mark?
My name is Mark Miller. I've been working on smart contracts in some sense since I'm going to date it to 1988, when Eric Drexler and I published our papers on what we called agoric open systems. In retrospect, one can read into it many of the elements of smart contracting, but there were also crucial elements missing. So I'm not trying to take away any credit at all from Nick Szabo in not only coining the term, but really bringing a lot of very important new ideas to it. So I had a notion of smart contracts which was inherently decentralized, and I was very disoriented by the whole world of blockchain-based commerce because it was very much not in my vision. I want to give a shout out to Jorge Lopez of Gravity, who, in starting a blockchain project based on my ideas, also figured out how to bridge between my vision and the blockchain-based modern crypto commerce world.
And we are talking about that, I think, a little bit in the panel. Yeah.
Great. Well, my name is Nathana Sharma, as Allison said. I currently am faculty at Singularity University in blockchain and also law policy ethics and their connections to accelerating technologies. I'm also partner at Crypto Lotus, which is a crypto hedge fund, and I think you'll get to hear more of our philosophy of the world tomorrow, and some of it today on the panel, obviously. And then in my former life, I was actually a practicing attorney, and I, even before that, have a background in mathematical logic, philosophy of mind, and neuroscience. And so for me, I'm passionate about blockchain technology as providing infrastructure for evolving systems of human cooperation.
My name is Zooko, and I got started on this stuff in 1995, so really late to the game compared to Markham. And the things that I've been lucky to work on for almost all of my career now are two things: cryptocurrency, which is what I was excited about in 1995, and encryption and decentralization, which I think of as almost the same thing, encryption and decentralization. And most recently, 3 years ago, I got to put those two together because some scientists had figured out how to combine encryption with cryptocurrencies. And that's what I spend all day and all night working on nowadays, which is a cryptocurrency named ZCash that's encrypted.
All right, cool. So let's start maybe with kind of like figuring out the forest from the trees. Like, what is the most exciting blockchain application that you know of today? Maybe that goes beyond crypto already.
Bitcoin.
Beyond crypto?
The token distortion field is strong, right?
Okay.
The bright light that is cryptocurrency.
That's my answer. The most exciting thing is Bitcoin.
Okay, cool. Any other?
Gas stations in space.
Gas station in
Yeah.
space? How come?
We're working with a company that is actually looking to establish gas stations in space. Their premise is that to open up any new frontier, if you look at the New World or the Wild West, in order to make it economically feasible, you need the commercial infrastructure to do so. So if you think about space travel, everything you take with you today has to come off the surface of the planet. The rocket fuel, the water, the food, the gear, the equipment, it's like a really extended camping trip, except you have to take all the stuff to get there and back. So they're going to establish an ability to refuel and rewater in space, in near Earth orbit, Mars, et cetera, to really enable the opportunity for commerce in space. And they're going to use blockchain in various different ways in order to enable that.
You should talk to Will Marshall, who will be doing the strategy session on lunar colonies tomorrow.
All right.
That's part of his argument.
Put it on the list. But that's, for me, when I was a kid, I wanted to be an astronaut and go into space. That's probably one of the coolest projects that we're working on right now.
Okay, Mark?
I think the thing I'm most excited about is that there are many blockchain projects. So I want to focus on being excited about the architectural diversity in the existing world of blockchain and excited to see that architectural diversity continue. What is a blockchain like Ethereum on which code runs? It's basically a time-sharing system. And the early days of time-sharing had a tremendous variety of architectural diversity, both in the hardware architecture and the operating system. And it's maintaining that diversity that led to the rapid innovation that gave rise to our current world. I bring that up because, to my mind...
Could you maybe say a few words about time-sharing?
Well, the early days of time-sharing, then the internet was introduced. It created a fabric between all these time-sharing systems so you could get the network effect while still maintaining the architectural diversity. The thing that scares me about many of the blockchain projects that each blockchain is built as if it's supposed to be the only blockchain in the world. And that the governance issue is that we need to arrive at a single overall agreement by some governance mechanism as to how that blockchain is run, and if you don't like it, you fork. And that agree or fork is terribly constraining compared to the architectural diversity that gave birth to the internet that we have now.
What about the blockchain interoperability projects that are happening so that Ethereum can talk to Fabric, can talk to, et cetera?
Yes, so that's specifically what I'm focused on as the thing I'm excited about is the things that create a spanning world of blockchains in a way that doesn't force them into architectural conformity.
Yeah, I remember like at the last panel that I moderated with you on, that is also on the Existential Hope Index, you were like scoffing at me because I called the panel Building Better Futures on the Blockchain. And you were like, this is really not the way the panel is supposed to be called. It should be Building Better Futures on Blockchains, right? So this panel I called Blockchains. But you still have the master key in here, right? And I thought about it. I thought, well, you know, what could I say instead? Master keys? Well, that's not, master keys defies the notion of a master key, right? And I think that's exactly the point that you're making, right? There is no master key, no one force to rule them all, or no kind of like one dominant force that can dominate others, but it's really this kind of like, I don't know, interaction of different types of keys or of different types of chains, right?
Yeah, so part of my idea of the future, the hopeful future that I imagine and want to work for, is a future in which there is no one decision that the world has to come to joint agreement on.
Okay.
So,
Amen.
Amen.
Amen to that. The thing that is most exciting to me is, I'm going to give an overall philosophy and then an example of a project, is the fact that blockchain technology is brand new in the scheme of technologies. Every other set of technologies that we're going to talk about today and tomorrow are much older. Blockchain technology has only been possible with solving Nakamoto consensus, with solving the Byzantine generals problem with Nakamoto consensus since 2009. And then in 2014, you have a radical sea change with the development of Ethereum. But that's brand new. So the fact that we have any projects that are not in the lab excites me. And I think it's also indicative of how fast our world is changing today. Relatedly, the thing that excites me the most right now is the fact that the state of Delaware, here in the United States, which is the corporate law capital of the United States, so over 300 of Fortune 500 companies are incorporated in Delaware. The state of Delaware is pursuing a range of blockchain initiatives, including on August 1st, a law went into effect saying, hey, corporations, you can manage key parts of your corporate governance on the blockchain. And I think that's huge because, you know, there's this divide between the future we want to see and how we get there, and the fact that governments as conservative as the state of Delaware here in the United States have gotten on board, and not only gotten on board, but gotten on board so fast is really exciting to me.
Okay, Zooko, you just stick with Bitcoin, say a word about it, or?
I'm not much of a futurist. I'm more of a presentist. Bitcoin is the most important thing right now. It's the most successful thing because the mainstream people have heard of it.
And it's bringing more investment into the space, whether it's on crypto specifically or larger applications.
Yeah,
absolutely.
and to what Nathana said, there is this beautiful moment. There's this simultaneous influx of all this capital and investment with a breakthrough, a science breakthrough, which reveals a whole field of other possibilities that may also work. What an amazing moment.
Okay.
I hope you guys tweeted him and the price of Bitcoin just went up.
Yeah, I was going to say, hope you're hodling.
Okay, so, well, after this kind of like rather positive outlook, like what's something, you know, what's like the most ridiculous application that you've heard about in the blockchain? Like what is one where you're just like, why, you know?
Gas stations in space.
Thanks.
Okay,
Appreciate
how come?
that. Yeah, fair. Believe it or not, they plan to be in operation in less than 15 years. So,
Okay.
So I've got a good one for this. I'm going to shout out to some friends who've made a project called Tensile Coin. And Tensile Coin is basically forgiveness on the blockchain. So it's a performance art piece, but it's fantastic. So if you have not yet heard of it, check out the website. And if any of you are concerned that maybe you've sinned and you'd like to get an indulgence, this is a modern day indulgence. And so what you do is you go onto the website and you pay ETH in exchange for having your sins forgiven. And this is my absolute
I'll give you my
favorite
public key.
ridiculous
I'd like to
Do that
change
for
my
me.
answer.
blockchain. Yeah. I have to say that I feel a lot more comfortable with eating chocolate cake now.
Oh, great.
That's about as bad as I get.
Well, there was a similar thing that a friend of mine had made up, and he went around at the recent Startup Society Summit saying like, yeah, you know, we're going to do this new group, and you have to buy in for it, and we're basically going to meet at Dolores Park, once a month, and we're all going to buy Bitcoin, and we're all going to scream like pump, 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 and then only a fraction of the group gets invited to the dump session, where they meet again and they all scream dump, 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 and dump, and it's like, he meant it as a total joke. It was also this kind of performance art piece. And people are really excited about it, for, I think, the wrong reasons, right? So there are, I think, a lot of ridiculous concepts out there, and it's really hard, at least for me, to distinguish which are good or not. And
Yeah, there's a lot of fraud and scams and Ponzi schemes happening right now, and that's the downside of this great moment when what was previously impossible was previously known to be impossible is now thrown into doubt. Combined with all this money flowing in, it's a perfect breeding ground for scams.
so what should people be wary of? What's a good indicator that something is more of a scam or just nonsense?
Read the white papers and use common sense. If it's not clear to you what the value is in the token and the coin, why would you invest in it? I don't know, maybe if they have good marketing or something.
A lot of the most successful scams are straight up Ponzi schemes, which are easily recognizable because they guarantee you returns in excess of the market rate.
Okay.
If it's too good to be true, probably is.
Yeah.
All right. And is there anything more, aside from ridiculous applications, more things where you're wary, these are things that should not be put on the blockchain? Not because it would be ridiculous, but because it would be dangerous. Is there anything that should be staying outside of the system? Or do you think it's blockchain everything?
So I want to raise a intellectual mystery that I've been trying to wrap my head around and haven't been able to figure out what the right way to approach is, which is, until recently, when I imagined what the world of crypto commerce would be like, I imagined a small number of currencies with wide reach, because currency, more than almost anything else, is all about the network effect of other people using the same currency. We're now seeing that the way this world is emerging is every project builds their own currency, or at least every project that ICOs builds their own currency, their own coin. And the result is that the world is emerging with thousands of microcurrencies, or thousands of types of coin. There's three perspectives I think I want to just raise as starting points for discussion. If cryptocurrencies are indeed more analogous to currencies as we understand them in economics, which the name would certainly suggest, then the ICO phenomenon is very dysfunctional in breaking up that world and making it so hard to trade across it. If coins are more like stock, then the fact that every organization issues its own is unsurprising and not dysfunctional. And the third one I'll only mention and let you look up the papers. Bill Tulla brought to my attention the writings of James Buchanan about what he calls club goods, which is one of the reasons people form clubs is to have a kind of good that can't be metered but is used as a commons within the club, but needs investment to create it. So,
Like
so
a
you
swimming pool?
So yeah, like, so you create a scarcity of entry to the club to manage the need to invest in something you can then not meter. And if coins are like club goods, then again, it's not dysfunctional. And, genuinely, of course, 50 years from now, coins will be their own thing, and people will think back to comments like mine that, why are you only reasoning by analogy? The economics of this thing is clear. I have no idea what those clear economics are, and I do also encourage everybody to try to see if you can reason from first principles to how to think about these coins.
I agree with you that one of your answers was that ICO tokens are like stocks. They're a funding mechanism, not a currency. I think that's the case. As a presentist, I tried to make a list of things that blockchains already actually do, and I only got 5 things so far.
Which are they?
Store of value, medium of exchange, which is a currency, and only Bitcoin is used for that so far. Name system, a substitute for DNS that doesn't allow some power to be able to hijack other people's domain names. ICOs, by which I mean a funding mechanism that circumvents the laws about funding mechanisms.
Isn't that repeating the first one, sort of? Funding and ICOs?
Well,
Or specifically, you added the circumvention of regulation, essentially, right?
yeah, and also the fact that there's a separate ICO token for each company or project, whereas the first one was Bitcoin, which was just one versus alternate investments. The last one's a technical thing, which is 2 out of 3 multi-sig, which is where you can have some money and you can make it so that there are 3 people, and if any 2 of them sign off, then the money moves to whoever both of the 2 out of 3 agreed on. And that's a thing that can actually be used, for example, for escrow. If you are buying something and there's a third-party arbiter who determines whether or not you actually delivered the goods, and that's actually being used. So that's the complete set of things. I may be probably overlooking things. You probably know 100 things, but those are the only 5 that I'm aware of that blockchains have been used for at the present.
Many of them are permutations of those 5, are applied different ways. Whether you're a land registry, right, or in trading land back and forth, that's a hold of value and also an escrow. Settlement, of course, any kind of opportunity to take one project we're working on takes groups of individuals that have no credit, essentially, are unbanked, and puts them together to make them a credit-worthy group, like a community, so that they can get financing for solar power for their community, which should, in theory, help the whole community have better water and better access to education and raise the whole community up. But it's almost like a community credit rating. Could you do that without blockchain? Probably, frankly.
Good point.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, so that's a good question when people are arguing about whether things are ridiculous or smart. A big question is, could you, I challenge you to say the same thing again you just said, but this time with no blockchain. And it's often possible, but I've been struggling for a long time to figure out what it is about these ICOs where the thing you couldn't do without blockchain is get it funded. So it's really, that's what I've concluded, that what ICOs are is a way to issue stock while circumventing the laws about issuing stock.
But you also
and
have
that's really valuable.
But you also have other kind of examples where I think big companies are just trying to put everything, or trying to, pitch that they're using blockchain by just basically using it as a data storage, or as this kind of really big spreadsheet or something, which is
EAI,
also not very
right?
useful.
Integrating their application systems with small amounts of data in a trusted fashion, in a kind of a private chain sort of fashion. As an enabler of end-sided markets where you're pushing more of the value of a transaction to the counterparties versus the intermediary that's making that market, that's going to be very powerful. Very powerful. Scares the heck out of the likes of Facebook and Uber and Lyft and people like that, but it's inevitable.
Okay, and then I think you already touched on kind of a future projection here. So projecting this outwards, right? We're just really in this like nascent industry. You said it's like exciting times, right? So where do you think, if we were gonna sit here again in like, let's say 15 years, right? Where do you, in a perfect world, in like a utopian world where existential hope has gone through, where do you see, what type of role do you see blockchain playing? And what kind of like role would it play in a dystopian world if things go wrong?
Okay, so whenever a question like that is asked, I'm going to substitute crypto commerce, by which I include blockchain, but as the category one is asking about. Because I don't think, as with Zooko saying, here's the things blockchains are good for, I think a lot of the things that we're talking about are not things for which blockchains are necessary, but some of them are. So blockchains are part of the overall future of crypto commerce. I think the sort of obvious thing is more of the market activity of the world moves on to crypto commerce as its substrate. And I think the most obvious reason for that is that markets need a set of rules enforced somehow. Trade is already mostly international, and law is mostly based in geographically defined jurisdictions. So there's already a really painful mismatch. In 1997 at Extro 3, run by Max Moore, I gave a talk titled Computer Security as the Future of Law. So I want to say, besides being the foundation for the future world of market activity, I also want to say I think we're building the future of democracy. I think part of the necessary architectural diversity that people are only now starting to explore is the ability to write smart contracts which are innovative, decentralized governance systems with interesting governance rules. And that puts us all in the position of Thomas Jefferson, of trying to figure out what are a set of governance rules for the new world with these very different situations that we're in, but once deployed and eventually taking over, can lead to a world we would like to live in.
Okay.
And I'd like to add that on the 15-year timescale, that effect is exponential and hard to evaluate how big of an effect it is. I think mostly positive. I think it's likely, and I think it's likely to be the most important effect on everything that you care about, like life extension and artificial intelligence and everything else 15 years from now, is whether the entire world has many times multiplied its aggregate wealth and aggregate power by the use of this, like Markham says, by the obvious application of just using this to make lower friction and more efficient trade and contracts globally.
For me to jump off what Mark and Zooko have said, I think when we think about, well, what will blockchain do in 15 years, it's not just blockchain in a vacuum. And so it's really what's blockchain going to do in concert with the other technologies that we're talking about today. And for me, the most interesting one is blockchain and artificial intelligence, particularly around governance. So the idea is, look, right now, are we in the position of Thomas Jefferson writing just with the help of his small library and admittedly his intelligence, but his pen and his paper? Or are we Thomas Jefferson but supported by a global network and also potentially artificial intelligence at a greater and greater level? And so ultimately, when I think about the global network society that we're moving into, where more and more of our interactions will take place in a roboticized, artificially intelligent set of networks. Think about autonomous cars. Who's going to be running the autonomous car grid? Who's going to be running the energy grid? I'd argue that we're going to see autonomous agents running those on the blockchain, because for me, the thing that's most fundamentally revolutionary about blockchain is how you share information. And instead of having information asymmetry between people who conduct transactions and a centralized authority, all of a sudden the way that information is distributed is radically different. And so our governing principles can shift accordingly.
All right. Yeah, you kind of also, you're binding in this new kind of like, class of like agents into contract systems, right? Right now we mostly have like contracts between like humans, right? Like they're made in natural language, but you could, like tie all kinds of other things in the way that you specify the blockchain here.
So if technology is the great disruptor, and most commercial entities are now aware of the disruptive nature of the internet and are kind of keeping their eyes open to it, if you think about the ability to decentralize and share value and provide governance in a decentralized fashion, that's going to disrupt governments and nation states and other entities like that. And it could have some pretty severe unintended consequences as these nation entities seek to defend their position of power.
Yeah,
That could be pretty dark.
I think it's kind of an interesting question, like generally on how much can we hope to even specify, right, in law terms, that can be automated, that can be automated via a smart contract. So is there anything, like there must be some kind of human mediator in it, at least for a little while, right, that kind of chimes in if these automated contracts aren't working well. How much can we specify? I think as Steve Mohundra on the last panel once like kind of proposed, it's kind of like we should have an AI that kind of like oversees everything and is like, okay, these are things that can be automated fairly. These are things where there's often disagreement, where there's still a mediator needed, and then it automates the things that it can, and then it defers to humans only when it has to. So where do you see hope for us being able to automate everything via blockchain, or are there some things that just can't really be specified enough?
I'm going to answer a question that's not quite the question you asked, but a little bit sideways of it. When people talk about smart contracts, there's a bit of a bait and switch going on. Because most of what we write in contracts is only meaningful when there's a human trying to judge what the contract means. Anytime a contract says something like reasonable, what does that mean?
Yeah.
So much of the richness of real-world contracts are things that cannot be codified now, and the progress of our ability to codify things will only gradually expand the fraction of contractual terms that can be interpreted by machine. Amex, the American Information Exchange, widely recognized as the first smart contracting system about 1991, had a notion that I call the split contract, where there's a part of the contract that's automated and a part of the contract that's still in prose, there to be interpreted by human arbiters if the contract is thrown into dispute. And in order to get to a world in which most of our contractual terms are automated, we have to transition through a world in which some of our contractual terms are automated. So in order for the split contract to become unimportant because we can codify all of it, we have to go through a world in which we've accommodated split contracts because we can only codify right now a small fraction.
That reminds me of there's a thing that's related to smart contracts that could be really valuable, and I haven't really heard anyone talking about it except for one paper that Markham wrote years ago, which is put it like this. There's a really strong problem with bad courts and bad enforcement. Also in the U.S., but much worse in other places, right? So I'm told that in India, you don't bother entering into contracts with business partners because if they were to fail at what they agreed to do and you would have to sue them, it would take you 10 or 15 years to get the case resolved, by which time it would be a lose anyway. So therefore, you just can't enter into deals and relationships with other people because you have no enforcement. Okay, so here's something that blockchain has made possible for us today already, but I'm not really aware of anyone using it, which is you could use this 2 out of 3 escrow system, and the two of you could elect a human mediator from a competitive and efficient system, not the publicly provided court system of India.
There's actually an open law project that in progress right now, looking at smart contracts and combining the pros with the code and getting that to an enforceable state. So it'll be interesting to see where that goes over the next few years. But to answer your question about what shouldn't be on the blockchain, hopefully human reproduction never lands there.
Okay, let's see.
That would kind of take the fun out of the whole thing.
Wow. So I would love for you to send me that paper that you're just referencing, which is Mark's, right, I guess, just so I can put it on the index as well. And I was wondering, which is kind of a question that relates to this kind of mediation into the human in the loop, right, which is a question like more generally related to governance, right? You touched on democracy already, but you wrote this article on like Tezos, right, and that, you know, their voting system is so good because it allows this kind of like conflict that is usually kind of like being fought half offline, half online, you know, by like Bitcoin developers, miners, whatever. It allows these kind of like disagreements to now be kind of like, they have a process for it now, right? You can vote on these things now. And that means that, you know, you incentivize people to really kind of like accept progress more quicker. So I would love for you to explain a little bit about that and whether you think it's only good for efficiency or if it actually has some way of becoming a democracy.
Sure, and let me preface the explanation with a question that I have that I think is related and will help us think through how these applications can work. So I think once we have a blockchain, we have transparency, we have immutability, depending on the blockchain, whether it's private, whatever. But let's just say once we have a blockchain, we have transparency, we have immutability, we get to know who's actually done what. So if anyone's ever tried to participate in a voting exchange with someone who lives in a swing state versus someone who doesn't, there are all kinds of ways in which we try to organize as humans now, and we have information asymmetry. There's a way that we might think, well, look, if you've got the immutability, you've got the transparency of the blockchain, we'll be able to make headway on these things. There's still the question of who gets to put the information into the blockchain, and how do we prevent fraud there? So, for example, you know, there are people working on voting projects for blockchain. I think those are great. They're happening. I'm aware of one in Australia. I'm sure there are many. Nick can probably tell us a dozen. But there's still a challenge of, you know, what's governing the value of the information that gets loaded into the blockchain. And I think here's where something like Tezos gets interesting. The governance thinks about that. So if you have a stake in Tezos, you want that blockchain to grow, you want it to experience network effects, you want it to be as exciting as Bitcoin, you want more people to use it. And so you can vote to pay developers to improve it as best as possible. And that said, there's a large attack surface too, because if you are a Bitcoin dominant diehard, you might not want another blockchain to be improved, and you might get a stake in the other blockchain in order to precisely sabotage it. And so I think this is kind of related to, you know, what do we get on the blockchain and how much do we get on there? I think we're not going to get away from human nature and human economic incentive structures until AI gets a little better. And so we want to be thinking about it in a dynamic, recursive, iterative context.
Isn't one of the points, though, not to take away the ability for bad actors, but to make it so expensive for them that it disincents them from being a bad actor?
I think that's one way of improving the system, but there's a question of what does it really take to be a bad actor? I mean, if we look at, and that's kind of its own, going off on its own tangent.
Even if your system is not being successfully sabotaged by enemies, there are problems. So there are network effects. And whenever we say that, we're thinking positive network effects.
Right.
But there are also negative network effects, which is the tragedy of the commons. And so that's why, if there were only positive network effects, we would all be part of the same network in all ways. But instead, there's a continuous regrowth and fragmentation and competition and things like that. And there's a negative network effect at a very, very large scale in our society today, which is national governments. They're very large and have a very wide scope and very much power. And policy and a consensus agreement is one of those things that tends to be more of a negative network effect than a positive network effect. The Congress and the crowd make worse decisions than you would have made for yourself if you didn't have to share that decision with everyone else, on average. So that's part of what is the most exciting and the most beneficial about this whole technological and financial breakthrough right now, is that it undermines those other larger networks.
I'd argue that part of the problems with the larger networks are what is possible with respect to the granularity with which you can start to make decisions? And what's the technology for consensus on a large scale? Like right now, that's extremely limited. And when you vote for a party or a person on a national level, you're not able to have a more finely variegated set of experiences. So again, I'm not saying larger network is always good. I just think conflating large national governments with larger networks isn't quite fair, because the way that large governments operate is limited by the technology that we have with respect to cooperation today.
Yeah, I was going to ask, because I think you were
Some don't cooperate at all.
Yeah, you once wrote this article on like one blockchain to rule them all, right? And I talked with Zooko once about, like, I remember when the fork was happening, you were saying, well, forks are actually a good thing on the long run.
You mean the Ethereum fork?
Yeah. Okay. Which of them? And you were saying, well, you know, like, it could actually be a good thing on the long run, because we see that in evolution all the time, right? Things spread, and it's this kind of like organic process that, you know, whenever something kind of like doesn't work so well anymore, then it takes two different paths, and it might accomplish the same thing faster, right? And that it's this kind of like, it's a sign of a healthy ecosystem that things fork rather than not.
Then through
so
a
I was
process
wondering
of natural
about
selection, the
yeah,
bad one
exactly.
dies.
So
right?
I was going to ask about this kind of difference between centralization versus decentralization here. Like, is it going to be, you know, Bitcoin or like one blockchain to rule them all, or do you think the future will be much more decentralized, and even in terms of like forks in different currencies?
That's exactly along the lines of what we were just talking about, because collective decision making is, in my opinion, a vast negative externality. And even if we can think of better ways and make it less bad for the next round of networks, I still think it's going to be a net negative, and it's not going to be a net positive, in my opinion.
I would just put out there a challenge, which is if the network gets too small, then things are not good. So if we're all reduced to being networks of one, because all of a sudden, as we have to collaborate and communicate, we're going to have to make compromises, that's not good either. So I'm not saying the bigger the better, but I do think we have a kind of a deep philosophical problem of, you know, where do you draw the line? And maybe it's fuzzy. But I also think when it comes to things like how are we going to operate on a global level with respect to nuclear weapons, catastrophic existential risk, I would rather see consensus, admittedly in the way that I want it, than one small group having a different view and having the power to bring something catastrophic to our planet as a whole.
Yeah, and those are also giant negative externalities, right? The ones that you named. And so you think of even if you accept my claim that there are negative externalities in large-scale governance, you still think that's the lesser of the evil compared to the negative externalities of global nuclear war or something else. Right. And I agree with you, it's not that smaller is better, nor that bigger is better. But in many cases, such as in the Ethereum fork, so Allison was saying that I had a heterodox opinion at the time. There was this widespread consensus, so to speak, among that industry, those scientists and those programmers and those business people, that bigger is better because of positive network effects of networks and cryptocurrencies. And so they said that fork and later other forks would be harmful to the overall system. And I disagreed and said the overall system would be bigger and healthier and more successul after the fork than before, and I was right so far.
So far.
And I think like you have an even more extreme view on this, right? Like you have a very decentralized approach to the blockchain ecosystem, and you really think that there's a lot that like our current ecosystem can learn from it. You, Christine, and I co-authored this paper on how blockchains could be used to counter cybersecurity threats, and that being a prerequisite for AI safety as well. So could you maybe say a few words on like why is the blockchain, why is it very decentralized, very hostile ecosystem a good thing? So
this is partial. I'm going to say a few words that I'll expand on tomorrow on the cybersecurity as existential risk.
He's holding a strategy session tomorrow.
Yeah, but just to very briefly state the premise behind what I'm then going to say, without defending the premise, all of the platforms all of the electronic platforms that our current civilization rests on with tiny exceptions, are not only insecure, they're insecurable. We've got this tremendous lock-in that we can fix bugs in our current system, but if you're trying to wholesale replace the architecture with something securable, then you've got to wholesale replace much of what runs on top of it, and I don't see any way for that to happen. Allison mentioned several times genetic takeover. Let me explain what that concept is, and then finally I'll answer her question.
Cool.
So genetic takeover is a term that I became familiar with that was introduced for a particular theory of the origin of life. Now, it doesn't matter with regard to understanding the term and its relevance, whether this theory of the origin of life actually makes sense or not, or what your opinion of it is. But it was the idea that initially the replicator was RNA, or at least at an earlier stage, it was just RNA machines making RNA machines, because RNA can act both as the coding spine and as the protein, as the ribosome is a machine mostly made out of RNA, not mostly made out of proteins. So you can make the machines that act as well as doing the coding. And then if you start there, you have to explain, well, how could you start there and end up with DNA and proteins rather than RNA? Why didn't RNA not get locked in? And the image that was explained then got labeled genetic takeover for the obvious reason. In the computer industry, once something's entrenched, once an architecture is entrenched, it can evolve incrementally, but it can't be wholesale replaced by just going after that niche. That's another externality that's quite hard to fight. However, what often happens is some new niche arises, and that new niche expands and comes to be a large niche in its own right and a new set of architectural foundations. Whatever happens to be there at the time can be carried along by the rise of the new niche. So, when I got into computers, mainframes, things like the IBM 370, were the entrenched reality, and many people had a hard time imagining a world in which our operating systems were not derived somehow from OS 360. Then the personal computer arose, carrying with it one of the worst instruction sets ever designed, the x86 instruction set. But it and the operating systems run on it, grew to dominance by growing in a new niche, and then that new niche became so important that it then took over the old niche. But it took it over from a position of strength. Now, the important thing about the world of blockchains is now, starting with Ethereum, they're not just systems of currency, they're systems of computation. And it's the first time that we have an ecosystem for people writing programs in which if they put insecure crap out there, they get punished quickly, and their insecure crap dies quickly. And that's because there's hundreds of millions of dollars that can often be siphoned off due to one trivial bug. It's happened repeatedly.
The DAO.
The DAO is the first most famous example of that. And the software with the bug dies quickly. On the other hand, our civilization rests on foundational software we cannot replace, whose architectural bugs were explained decades ago and are not being fixed. So in this new ecosystem, for the first time, we're creating an ecosystem that's only going to be, in which everything insecure is going to be killed quickly, and that means it's going to be populated by the survivors of that process. Now, the big question, the big open question for which I'm very pessimistic is, can that new ecosystem grow fast enough that when the systems on which our civilization rests are brought down in flames by cyber insecurity, that the things that are left standing are big enough that we can survive by extending them.
Okay. If you want to know more about this, and you've really kind of mind-boggled me when we first started talking about this, then definitely go and see Mark in his strategy session tomorrow. We don't have very much time, and I do want to take time for questions. But I would like to start on this kind of like obligatory question, right, which I think has been in the minds of a couple of others here, which is like, are we in a bubble now in terms of cryptocurrencies? And this is a very kind of like short-term question, right? So is what we're seeing right now with this incredible rise, but also this volatility, is it the mainstream buying in, which would be a rather good sign, or is it really more kind of us being past the peak? And then what kind of crash is it going to be? Is it a total crash, like the financial crash, or is it more going to be like, hey, maybe we are at this on the downward for a little while, but then we have like Gartner's hype cycle where eventually we will enter mainstream adoption. So in like a sentence, really, because we don't have more time, where do you think we are in terms of bubble mania? Because for Halloween, Zooko and I went as crypto bubbles with these big bubble costumes, and we really spooked some people out.
Yeah, it was a scary Halloween costume, a Bitcoin bubble.
It'd be a lot bigger now.
I'm not going to make price predictions, but I am going to say that there is a substantial amount of capital that wants to get into cryptocurrencies and can't yet. So it's been sort of squirting through a straw, and the bottlenecks are going to be widened over the next 6 to 12 months, so that capital can flow into cryptocurrencies. And that capital probably weighs somewhere between 10 billion and 1 trillion US dollars worth.
Okay,
so I'll state
not
that.
Past the peak yet. Not past the peak.
Those are not predictions, those are assertions
of course.
That I believe to be true today, because I'm a presentist.
Cool. Good, Nathana.
So I think that crystal ball consulting aside, I agree with Zooko in the sense that this market is still tiny compared to almost any traditional market. So I'm not going to say Bitcoin is for sure going to be a stable store of value, but if it is, if you look at other stable stores of relatively stable stores of value, you look at real estate or gold, the markets are just so radically different in size. And not even with respect to store of value, but pretty much any means for exchange of humans that's wide scale and global. If you try to compare the current size of the crypto markets to any one of them, the crypto markets are tiny. And so I can't tell you when and how exactly there are going to be crashes, but I'm long-term 5 to 10 years very bullish, because I think we found a new way for humans to be able to transact.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, Mark?
I'm going to take the position that that Bitcoin is a bubble. All these cryptocurrencies are bubbles, but that's because of the definition of bubble, and by the definition of bubble, almost all real-world fiat currencies are bubbles too. And based on that precedent, I want to say, just because it's a bubble doesn't mean it's going to come down. A bubble is when the thing that's traded has no intrinsic value and is traded based only on the expectation that other people will then value it so that it can profit you to obtain it in order to trade it again. By that definition, every fiat currency is a bubble. The mystery is that fiat currencies show us that some kinds of bubbles have a dynamic that has to do with their use in a currency-like manner that causes them to stay stable over long historical periods of time. What we don't know about cryptocurrencies is, are they currency-like in the relevant manner? And if they are, then perhaps they will increase to the point that they become a widespread spread currency and stay
So
up
just
in the
the
same
normal
sense.
bubble.
just the normal bubble that, in the same sense the dollar is a bubble.
Okay.
I am not a financial advisor, and this is not financial advice. But I do hope that there is a correction so I can afford to buy more.
Okay, great.
And I think Zooko is absolutely right. Talk to very, very influential financial people all the time, and they don't even know what blockchain is yet.
All right.
So as they learn more and they start to understand its possibilities, the money is flowing in.
So it's not only to the moon, but really to Mars.
And beyond. To infinity and beyond.
Of course,
Because
if you have your space station, like gas.
Because of what you said, I wanted to say I would actually be quite happy. So what I said suggests that it'll keep going up. But I would be quite happy if there were a correction because it would kill off lots of Ponzi schemes and scams and bad projects. There's rainfall and growth and flourishing and spreading, and then there's weeding out the worst ones.
That's
and we
right.
need to have both in cycles.
Some blockchain gardening. Okay, if you want to know more about that, Melanie Swan is holding a session on blockchain economics tomorrow, and I was gonna ask a little bit more about where different nation states going to be, and what can we say about the Chinese crackdown of the exchanges, like the SEC coming in, and Coinbase having to confess some of its users, right? But I'm sure that will all be tackled tomorrow. So if you want to know about the specifics, and and there's one strategy session by crypto loaders on the cryptocurrency landscape, and then there's one on blockchain economics, which is a little broader. Okay, thank you so much. This was great.